space at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Katie.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you everyone for taking some time out of your busy days to join me today. We'll be talking about the cycle of cyber threat intel, how cyber threat intelligence is more than just a finished product, it's also a process. We'll be going over some of the fundamentals that you need to know at every step of that process. So who am I? As Carol said, I'm Katie Nichols. I am a SANS instructor for Forensics 578 Cyber Threat Intelligence, and my day job, I'm also the Attack Threat Intelligence Lead at the MITRE Corporation. I've been doing network defense and threat intel for over a decade now, and really my passion, what I seek to do with my time. So with that, let's dive right in. So we're talking about cyber threat intel. Let's start at the third word of that, intelligence. What is intelligence? You'll see a lot of different definitions from academics and practitioners, and they all have a couple key components I wanted to highlight for you. One we use here up on the screen for you, collecting and processing of information. That's the first key part of any intelligence definition. Now, intelligence is different than data or information. It has to be analyzed or processed. Next part, about a competitive entity or its agents. Yeah, it's about adversaries, some kind of competitive entity that we're collecting on, that we're analyzing information on. And the last key part, needed by an organization or group for its security or well-being. This is what I call the selfless part of the definition. As intel analysts or CTI analysts, we're selfless. We don't do intel for ourselves, but it's for someone else who needs it to solve a problem, make a decision. Another key point about intel, it's a product and a process. So often people think, well, I just have an intelligence report or maybe a blog post about an actor. There's a whole process behind it, and that's what I really want to dive into today to reveal to you. Okay, so we know what intelligence is. Let's talk about cyber threat intelligence. So adding on to that intelligence definition, again, analyzed information. To become intelligent, something has to go through a process of analysis. It's not just raw data, because then why would we need CTI analysts? The next part, about the hostile intent, capability, and opportunity of an adversary. Again, focusing on adversaries. One thing to highlight there is we define a threat as having to have those three components: intent, opportunity, and capability. So if you think about that for a second, maybe for example, the UK government, they have the capability to, maybe spearfish the US government, but if they don't have the intent, then they're not really a threat. So think about those three components of a threat: intent, capability, and opportunity, of course, of an adversary. And again, that satisfies a requirement, which we'll talk about today. CTI, again, isn't for a CTI analyst, it's for some decision maker who gives a requirement to the CTI team. So now we know a little bit what intel is, what CTI is. This is a concept that if you have any kind of a formal intel training, you've likely seen, the intelligence cycle. This is all about the fact that, again, to produce intel, it's this whole cycle. You have to plan out what you're going to do. You have to collect some information and data. You have to process that, analyze it, produce some product, and then disseminate it. And we're going to apply this to cyber threat intel today, because I think a lot of times people miss the fact that cyber threat intel is all of these things. It's not just the output of what you see, maybe a blog post or a report or some indicators or behavioral TTP info. It's the whole process behind that. So let's dive in. Let's start out with planning and direction. If you're going to start out doing a CTI, what do you need to know about this part of the cycle? Well, let's start with why you might want a CTI team to begin with. A couple different reasons. What a CTI team does, well, they can support a security operations center, for example. A lot of SOCs that I've worked in, they are flooded with a bunch of different alerts. They don't know what to prioritize. It's a great function for a CTI team. They can come in and say, hey, alerts of this type might be this adversary that we really care about. Might be able to enrich. I know a lot of SEMs have alerts on certain indicators, maybe IPs or domains. CTI team can come in and say, hey, you might care about these ones, or if you get a hit, let me help you figure out if that's important to you or not. Similarly, they can help with incident response, supporting incident responders who may or may not be in the SOC. I've seen it both ways, enriching what they find in that response. Also, information sharing. Many CTI analysts I know kind of help out those incident responders in reaching out to other analysts or other responders at different organizations? Are we seeing the same thing? How is this, overlapping with others or not? And those are both more to more tactical operational level. Going up to that strategic level, how can CTI analysts support? Well, again, I talked about how Intel and CTI is for someone else. That can support different decision makers who have to decide, maybe should we acquire a certain business, or what resources should we prioritize? Should we buy a new tool? Should we hire new analysts? All those decisions at a more strategic level. So just a few reasons as you plan out, well, why might I need a CTI team? There are a couple to think about for you. All right, so you decided we want a CTI team to do some things. You gotta structure that team. Now, I'd say there's no one answer about where you should place a CTI team in an organization. One good rule of thumb is if you have like a CISO or a CSO, placing the CTI team under that organization with a SOC, with incident responders, malware analysts as peers to them, that's a decent place to put it. But the thing to remember here when you decide where to put it is that they're going to be influenced by whatever part of your organization the CTI team sits in. So for example, if they sit in the SOC, they're probably going to be responding to those SOC analysts, helping them out, helping them prioritize alerts. If they sit in the vulnerability management team, they sit under that team, they're probably going to be prioritizing vulnerabilities and worrying about patching. So think about that. Ideally, you want it in some kind of central location if you want your team to be supporting all these different functions. The other thing to remember as you set up your team and structure that in this planning step of the process, think about a diversity in your team. Not just race, gender, educational background, socioeconomic status, those are all important, but also diversity of thought. And that comes sometimes with having different backgrounds. The reason that's so important, we'll talk about later, as humans and as analysts, we all have biases, ways of looking at the world. And if you bring in different people into that team who have different ways of thinking, that's great for analysis. Your analysis is going to be stronger, more carefully thought through. So think about that as you're setting up your team. Don't just hire 5 people from the same organization, from the same background. Spice it up. It's interesting when you have a diverse team and you disagree, and it makes for better analysis. Other things to think about as you're doing this planning and direction part of the process. 3 key fundamentals that I think any CTI team should have: intelligence requirements, a threat model, and a collection management framework. Again, these are foundational things, but so many teams that I've seen don't have these. I think if you have them in your team, you're much more likely to be successful. So let's dive into each of these. First off, intelligence requirements. These are just requests for what people in your organization need from the CTI team. They're gaps or questions that they need to have answered, objectives that analysts can help them satisfy through this process of doing cyber threat intelligence. A good rule of thumb is that if you have a list of intelligence requirements, it's good to keep it public within your organization. Not public to everyone, it's a terrible idea, but within your own organization, because then people know, hey, the CTI team is looking out for the things that I care about, my pain points or my gaps, and they're trying to satisfy those for me. How do you generate intel requirements? Well, I found that a lot of people, when you say the word requirements, they kind of freeze because it sounds really formal. And many governments do have a formal process of creating these requirements, but think about them as questions or pain points or needs that your organization has. So a great thing to do if you're starting a new CTI team, go out there, talk to different people in your organization, find out what their problems are, and then interpret those into requirements and help them kind of figure out what they might need. A good requirement is going to ask a single question. So it's not, is Russia going to target us and is China going to target us? It's one of those things, one question at a time. And the key here is really, again, what I said earlier, CTI isn't for the team, it's for someone else in your organization. So having these requirements helps you avoid this self-licking ice cream cone problem. We create intel for other people, not for ourselves. Here are a couple example of intel requirements to help you get your mind around, what they are, what do they mean. Strategic level, maybe that executive, that decision maker, what business units are at most risk to cybercrime? That could help them inform, hey, where do we need to maybe have more resources? At the operational level, that's often where people track groups or clusters of activity. Well, what activity groups or threat groups or campaigns are currently active in our industry? Because then we can help prioritize resources against those. At a tactical level, maybe your SOC analysts, your incident responders, they want to know what are the behaviors that they should focus on to identify threats in our organization. Maybe they need a list of indicators or TTPs that they should monitor for at that tactical level. So again, these are all examples of different requirements, different questions that people in your organization might ask that the CTI team can help answer. So that was the first key thing you need in your planning and direction fundamentals. The second one is threat modeling. Now, threat model is a term that I hear thrown around a lot. It's really confused a lot. So threat modeling is all about knowing what you have in your organization that the adversaries might want and bringing those two things together. That's all it is, knowing yourself and knowing the adversary. But it has to have those two key components. A lot of times, my day job is in the MITRE attack team. People will call attack a threat model. That's just a knowledge base of different adversary behaviors. It doesn't take into account your organization. So that's not really a threat model. It has to have those two key pieces. There are lots of ways you can go about threat modeling. So this is just a notional high-level approach. So start out again by knowing your own organization. What do you have that the adversaries might want? So notionally, maybe we have financial data, we have some intellectual property, and we care about our system availability, our uptime. That's what we have. Then you can start to look and gather information about activity groups or threat groups or different campaigns. What have they done in the past, or what are they likely to care about out of what you have at your organization? So maybe activity group A, we've seen them go after financial data and intellectual property in the past. So we start to make that mapping, that modeling. Activity group B has gone after intellectual property, and activity group C has gone after system availability. Again, this is really high level, very simplified. So you could go much more detailed, getting down to, what software versions do adversaries target to try to figure out where you should patch, where you should prioritize resources. But at a high level, threat modeling, all about what you have that the adversaries might want, trying to bring those things together. The third thing to think about as you go through this planning and direction part of the process, collection management framework. So we have to do analysis, we have to get data and information from somewhere to produce intelligence, but how do we know what we have to work with, what we can collect? And that helps us answer the question, well, what are these requirements, all these questions people in our organization are asking us? Which of those can we really satisfy or fulfill? Well, a collection management framework is a view of the different collection sources you have. What data and information, how long do you have it for? And then that helps you decide, hey, what of these requirements can I satisfy? What kind of analysis can I actually do? So here's an example of one based on different malware information you could have. And this is external collection, but you could do this for internal sources as well, maybe different log sources. Many SOCs that I've worked in, you walk in the first day and you're so confused. You got proxy logs, you got host-based logs, you got email gateway logs. Some are kept for 30 days, some for 60 days, some for 7 days. Having that information all in one place can be really powerful from an internal collection side as well as an external side, like we have on the slide here. So just taking a look at this, the different rows, we have the different sources that we can collect malware data from. Virus total, Facebook threat exchange, malware.lu, lots of different ones. And then in the columns, we have the different information that we could get from each of those sources. So first and last seen dates, maybe IP, domain information, who is information. And pretty quickly, you can start to see the power and how this might be able to help us. So if you look, okay, where do we have gaps? Which columns do we have no information in? Well, pops up pretty quickly, historical who is information. We don't have that in any of our malware collection sources. So if you looked at your requirements and maybe one of your requirements was to kind of track historical intrusions, you might say, well, hey, based on our current collection, we can't do that right now. So maybe that's a pitch for you to get more resources. We need a collection source that can give us that information. This can also let you look at maybe where's redundant. None of us have a ton of info or a ton of money. So maybe you can look at what's redundant. Again, you look at IPs and domains, those two columns. Well, a lot of our sources have that information. So if you had to get rid of a few, maybe you can use this as a way to prioritize what you can get rid of. So again, collection management framework, I'd say that third piece of the planning and direction step that should really focus on having both an internal and external collection management framework can help you figure out what of those requirements can I actually satisfy with the data that I have, or are there things that are critical or that I should be asking for in terms of additional resources. That's our planning and direction phase. Next up, collection. So we've planned out, we got a team set up, we got our threat model, we got some requirements, we got a collection management framework. We have to actually collect some information and data for us to analyze and produce this intelligence. A lot of different sources that we can use in trying to do CTI. A couple of those that we'll talk about today just briefly: intrusion analysis, malware, domains, lots of different external data sets, and TLS certificates is kind of a fun one. So we'll go through each of these briefly. They're not exhaustive. There are lots of ways and resources that you can use to get a CTI, but here are a few key ones. First off, intrusion analysis. So many people, when they start a CTI team, immediately will go externally and say, well, what feed or what vendor can we buy from? Which those sources can be really valuable, but your own internal data, your internal information about what adversaries have done on your own networks, that can be the most valuable data source. So don't overlook your own analysis. A great way to do intrusion analysis is using the Lockheed Martin kill chain. All you're doing here, it's this 7-stage process of how adversaries go through an intrusion. They do reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery exploitation, installation, command and control, and then lastly, their actions on objectives. And you can use the kill chain to break down kind of what you've seen in different intrusions as just a way to bucket that data, as we'll talk about later, and help you understand what happened in this intrusion in your own environment, and then use that information about adversaries to respond to those requirements and produce cyber threat intel. Another key data source in CTI is, of course, malware. Many of the analysts that I talk to freely admit that malware is a key source that they use. They troll VirusTotal all day. They write Yara signatures. They look at malware that adversaries are developing because it's a great resource. They come after us with something. So malware is a great source, but beware, because that's not everything. We so often talk about living off the land, or Windows built-in tools that adversaries use. And so malware isn't the end-all be-all, but it is an incredibly valuable collection source that you as a CTI analyst should absolutely be paying attention to. Malware collection, can't talk about malware without talking about malware zoos, a term I love because I just imagine like little malware samples as little animals trying to get out of the zoo. VirusTotal is the most popular one here, obviously, but others, Hybrid Analysis, Joe Sandbox, many of these. The idea there is it's sort of an online sandbox where you can upload malware samples. That's awesome because sometimes adversaries upload malware samples. Unit 42 has done some really cool analysis. I believe it was on Oil Rig, where they've tracked how Oil Rig was using VirusTotal to test or another sandbox to test their samples and see the detection rates. So adversaries might upload malware there, researchers do, AV companies do. It's a really great source. A lot of people, again, write Yara signatures to search through VirusTotal and try to find new malware. Everyone wants to get kind of as close to the adversary as you can. So if you start to try to track as adversaries might be developing malware, that can be a really powerful technique to try to catch them before they come into your network. Another thing that people often overlook, you can create your own malware zoo. VirusTotal, others, Hybrid Analysis have a ton of malware samples, but if you start over a series of years to upload your own malware into a central place, using something like Cuckoo Sandbox, that can be a great repo for your own collection of malware. The second collection source, we've got to talk about domains. So, the wealth of information on domains, whether it's passive DNS, who is information, and in domains, it's all about this idea of pivoting. So maybe we start with a single indicator, badactor.com. We pivot through, maybe we do some who is lookups based on our collection management framework, whatever data we have, and we say, hey, what's the who is information? Maybe is there a registrant email that's interesting? Okay, let's see. We think this registrant email on this domain might be relevant to us, so let's validate that. Let's do a search and pivot on that and see, are there other domains that have used the same email address? Then we can validate and start to identify, hey, the same registrant email address is used in this other domain that looks pretty suspicious. So going from one piece of data to another. And you can do this with domains, of course, but with many other types of indicators. Pivoting is a great skill for CTI analysts to have. And here's an example. This is an older example from a group called Putter Panda. So starting again, that C2 domain, gamemuster.com. Again, caveat, do not visit any of these domains or IPs. I don't know if they're still up, but let's not find out today. All right, There's my waiver, there's my disclaimer. So starting from that C2 domain, again, let's look at that registrant data, that whois information. Find the cpyy.chen email address. What IP did it resolve to, this 184.ip? And then looking at, hey, what other samples were calling back to that same IP address? So starting from the single C2 domain and finding a bunch of different hashes of different malware samples. Pivoting is awesome and you should do it, but beware the Kevin Bacon effect, right? The 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. You can associate any actor in any movie back to Kevin Bacon when less than 6 hops. And the same thing applies to CTI. You could probably show somehow that the US government is working with the UK government, is working with the Russians to attack the Brazilians. Like, you could try to claim so many things based on pivoting. So know when to stop, because otherwise you might go a little crazy and start to, connect the yarn on your wall between all the information. So I always say, the closer the pivot, the more accurate it's likely to be, or the higher confidence you can have in it being connected. Once you start to get more than like 2 or 3 pivots out, be a little more cautious, I would say. Next, collection source is sort of a broad one. There are a lot of different external data sets. We often talk about threat data feeds. So I have a few threat intel pet peeves, and one of them, people talking about data feeds and calling that threat intel feeds. As we've talked about today, threat intel has to be analyzed. Information is responsive to a requirement. So a list of things like IP addresses and domains, while it can be useful, that is not threat intel. So please, if you take nothing else away from this webcast, please remember that and just call them data feeds, threat feeds, that's fine. Please don't call them threat intel feeds, or I'm going to get really sad and I might tweet about it. So again, we're talking about just different feeds, different lists of things like IP addresses, maybe hash values, starting to see more TTPs, behavioral information in there as well. And again, these external data sets can be really valuable, but watch out. Look for a few key things. Where is the data coming from? Does it matter? Is it responsive to those requirements that you have for your team? And a lot of people will take external data feeds from different companies and plug them right into your SIEM, do alerting or blocking. You can do that, but be cautious. Sometimes there are false positives in there. So a couple recommendations, things to look out for if you're trying to evaluate threat feeds. First off, it should let you pivot to additional context. So if I have a certain IP address, it shouldn't just be sitting out there alone, because you got to have context. For something to be an indicator, you need to have data and context for it to be useful to you. So you should be able to pivot in and find out, well, how is this IP used? Is it command and control? What's the original report? Is there information I can grab about it? Should be focused on maybe your industry, threats you care about. So it's really tough, and I feel bad for vendors. It's hard to kind of tailor threat feeds to a bunch of different customers, but talk to different vendors, and many of them are willing to explain, here's how we focus, here's the kind of collection we have, the information we have. Is it relevant to you? Again, going back to that collection management framework, vendors who sell these feeds might not want to say exactly where the information comes from, but they should be willing to give you a high level idea. Yeah, we go through Virus Total and look at new malware samples. That helps us drive, what we put in these feeds. Also, valuing quality over quantity. I too often have seen folks who feel like the more indicators, the more data they have, the safer they are. We got to get rid of that fallacy. The quality of indicators or behaviors or different intel you have that you can create out of these feeds is much more important than the quantity that you have of it. On the negatives, look for if they're, RFC 1918, those non-routable IPs, or public domains, Microsoft.com, Google.com. That might be a red flag. You might want to avoid that feed. Also, if you can't find that context, that could be a red flag as well. And just remember, again, that these threat feeds can be incredibly useful, but they're not going to be plug and play. The point of them is as a collection source for you to do cyber threat intel, not as, bam, you plug this feed in and it's going to do cyber threat intel for you, because that's a human process, as we've talked about today. Another collection source, and this one has just kind of come into vogue the past couple of years. I first found out about it at the CTI Summit when Mark Parsons gave an amazing presentation I'd highly suggest checking out. So TLS certificates are digital certs used in securing communications. So, you go to a secure website, you kind of click on the little lock icon on your browser, and it shows you the certificate that signs that communication. Previously, they were called SSL certs. People often use these interchangeably, TLS versus SSL. This is a cool data set because, as I said, it's only really come into vogue for analysts in the last couple of years. So if you have older infrastructure, maybe you tried pivoting on who is information or other pivots and you didn't really get much, TLS certs can be a really useful source to go back and look at some of those, 5-year-old intrusions. Hey, were there any TLS certs that maybe the adversaries used the same IP, used the same cert on two different IPs, IPs out of their command and control infrastructure? And there are a couple different collections out there, both free and paid TLS certificate collection sources, census.io, scans.io, Circle, and Passive Total are just a couple. Don't advocate for any of those over the others. Like everything, there are pros and cons to free versus commercial sources. But this can be a really cool collection source where you can start to look at those overlaps. Hey, did adversaries reuse TLS certs across their different infrastructure? Because adversaries kind of, like me, I'm a little lazy sometimes, and adversaries are human too. So they might reuse things, and that's a great opportunity for you as a CTI analyst to find the links between things. So those were our different collection sources, malware, domains, TLS certs, and don't forget your own internal data, your own intrusions that you analyze. So great, we have all this data, this information, we got to process it somehow so we can do this analysis thing. So we have many different structured models and frameworks that we can use. And the point of these is just to put data into buckets. And we have a whole bunch of bucket GIFs and memes for you here. That's the idea, is break down all this information you have. I can't keep track of everything as an analyst. I think it's on average, the human brain can only track 7 different things at once. And you have much more than 7 things to track when you're tracking different adversaries. So by bucketing data, using models and frameworks, it allows you to start to look for patterns in an easier way. It allows you to kind of look for those, that structured information and use that to try to figure out are there patterns or there overlaps in what my adversaries are doing. So lots of different frameworks and models you can use. We talked about the kill chain already. We'll talk about briefly the diamond model, MITRE ATT&CK. Varus is also one to look at if you're kind of bucketing that incident data. So introducing a few of these. First up, the diamond model. One of the creators of this, Sergio, said he might be on the call, so you might be in the presence of Sergio as well today. So the diamond model states that any intrusion event can be broken down to these 4 key components. The adversary who did the intrusion, the victim of it, some capability, often a malware TTP that the adversary used, and then the infrastructure by which that capability was deployed. Great thing about the diamond model is it's really simple when you first look at it. We'll talk about later how you can make it a little more complex, but it's a really useful model that you can use to try to track, okay, for each intrusion, what are these 4 key aspects? And then an easier way that you can start to look for commonalities between these different vertices of the diamond model. Another framework, obviously I have to talk about this because it's my day job. So MITRE ATT&CK is a knowledge base of different adversary behaviors, describing different tactics and techniques that adversaries can use. So see this matrix view down here. Across the top are different tactics, which are the adversary's technical goals, things like initial access. Then under each tactic are techniques, things like spear phishing with an attachment. That's how the adversary achieved that initial goal of initial access. So another framework, and again, the point here is just you have a bunch of information about what adversaries are doing. If you start to break down and divide either using the diamond model, the kill chain, or using attack techniques, here are the techniques that I've seen an adversary use. You can start to look for patterns, compare and contrast, and better track different adversary behaviors. In this processing and exploitation phase, we have to store this information somewhere. And this is where we get into our discussion of threat intelligence platforms, TIPs. Many teams, when they're starting out, will start with a TIP. I'd recommend think about first what you need it to do. This is something that a lot of people miss. The point of a threat intel platform is to help you do threat intel. I know it seems kind of self-evident and obvious, but you might have different requirements for what you want it to do than another team. So it's not really one size fits all. The goal is that a tip should help you store information in a way that helps you do intel analysis. So a couple different tips, open source ones mentioned. CRITS is actually one that's developed by a team at MITRE. MISP is becoming really popular. ThreatNote is a lesser known one, and Yeti, different open source tips that you can use. With deciding whether you use open source or commercial, there are always pros and cons. I always say, do you want to spend your money on a person, an engineer, to try to implement your tip, or do you want to spend money on a commercial option? There's no right or wrong answer. It really depends on your own requirements for what you want the tip to do to support your intel analysis. So again, the pros of open source, they're free. That's awesome. There's also active development communities, especially with MISP, for example. Sometimes if you tweet them a feature request, they'll have it done within a few hours. So that's awesome to have a community of people, and free things are nice. But sometimes open source platforms, and a lot of folks that I've talked to who use these, they say, well, we have a dedicated engineer. It's their full-time job to maintain it, to customize it for what we need. On the commercial side, I decided I'm not going to name them because there are so many of them, and I'd probably just make someone mad because there are lots of great commercial tips out there. The pros there is there's someone who wants you to succeed. There's a vendor that you've paid for this option. They're going to probably help you integrate into your environment. I've talked to a lot of people who work at tips who they'll actually come in and help your threat intel team figure out what you should be doing. So that's an awesome benefit. Cons, if they can be pricey. Of course, there are lots of different price points for different tips, and they might not fit what you need exactly for your team. So again, think about what your requirements are for a tip. The point of a tip is to support your intel analysis. It's not like a plug and play, great, we have a tip, so we're a CTI team. Think about what you need it to actually do. So that was that processing and exploitation phase. You got to put the data into buckets. You got to store it somewhere. Now we get to the fun part. Kind of this is sort of the bread and butter of any CTI analyst's job, is the analysis and production phase. When we do analysis, it's really important to remember that we all have bias. I'm not talking about, we usually talk about bias and prejudice together, treating people differently because of certain attributes about them. Yeah, that's absolutely wrong. That's not what we mean by bias here. We're talking about cognitive biases, which just constraints or different ways that we view the world. Inherently, I've come up from a different background than you all have, and so we view the world differently. And those biases are part of being human. That's why, if I see a bus barreling down the road, I don't stop to think about it. I jump out of the way. It's part of what we are as humans. But as analysts, we have to figure out how to hedge against these, because they can cause us to produce analysis that's not so great, that jumps to conclusion that is, not well thought through. So try to defeat that bias as you do analysis. And luckily, there are some methods to do that. An example, really common cognitive bias people talk about is confirmation bias, where you try to selectively support this one hypothesis you have. You try to seek evidence that supports that, and anything that kind of doesn't support that single hypothesis, you kind of just brush off. I think a great place to look for biases is anytime you feel yourself getting emotional about something. And I live in the DC area, so one thing I get really emotional about is traffic. So my own hypothesis is that out of DC, Maryland, and Virginia drivers, that Maryland and DC drivers are much worse than Virginia drivers. So that's my hypothesis. I live in Virginia, so a little bit of my own bias showing there. And so I'm driving to work out in McLean, and someone cuts me off. Man, it's a Maryland driver. That supports my hypothesis. That jerk. Maryland drivers are the worst, but if a Virginia driver cuts me off, oh, they're probably just having a bad day. That doesn't really meet my idea that Virginia drivers are the best, so I'm just going to ignore that evidence. So that's a really simple example of everyday life, but this happens all the time in CTI. You think, oh, it's maybe my favorite adversary group here, and so you start to collect evidence. Oh yeah, this C2 IP totally overlaps, and this TTP, they used this in the past. That can cause you to overlook other evidence that might be really important in forming your analysis and your assessment. So keep these biases in mind. I love Richard Hoyer is sort of the OG on this topic. He has a great book, Psychology of Intelligence Analysis, little purple book, but it's free PDF on the CIA website. Talks about, there are tons of different biases here that he talks about. And it's really important to be aware of what these are, because then you can start to call them out amongst your team and sometimes even yourself, though that's pretty tough. So the good news is, in addition to just kind of knowing your biases, which is important, there's a way to try to reduce that using structured analytic techniques. So I mentioned Richard Hoyer. He's known as kind of the father of this one structurally analytic technique called analysis of competing hypotheses, ACH, where you basically line up your hypotheses and your evidence and try to look for the hypothesis with the least refuting evidence to try to counter that confirmation bias and other biases. But there are a lot of simple structurally analytic techniques you can use as well. Brainstorming, that's a really obvious one. Just get everyone in a room. Hey, we have this intrusion. Who might it be? Let's just brainstorm some different ideas. Again, the idea here, whatever structurally analytic technique you choose, start to put structure to that analysis, starting to hedge against those biases. Even as something as simple as, devil's advocacy as well. Hey, sometimes you might be this person in the room who just questions, hey, are you sure? Like, what about this hypothesis? Have you considered this other thing? Doing the structured analysis, whatever technique you choose, can help you hedge against those biases, start to put things on paper, start to structure out what you know, and it can lead to better analysis, better decisions to support those different requirements. There's another great book Richard Hoyer created. It's a little more expensive. I think it's like $60 on Amazon that has a full, I think it's 55 different structured analytic techniques. So Psychology of Intelligence Analysis isn't enough for you. Check out Richard Hoyer's other book on structured analytic techniques. It's a pretty awesome one. You can go through, even based on the problem you're trying to solve, look up different techniques that can help you out there. When you're doing this analysis, also think about there are a lot of different ways to do analysis. I am a huge fan of Microsoft Excel, and I would argue that it is the best CTI tool of all time. Almost every team uses it. Whenever I'm starting on a problem and trying to do analysis, I often throw things into Excel. Whiteboards, that can be a great way to analyze data as well. Just throw things up there, start to draw links between them. Link analysis using an open source or a tool like Maltiga or Palantir, lots of other link analysis tools. There are many ways to do analysis, many different structured analytic techniques. So challenge yourself. No, I love Excel, but maybe I should challenge myself and try link analysis sometimes. Also surround yourself with people who think differently than you. Going back to that planning and direction phase, when you're setting up your team, think about people who like to analyze problems differently, because it's really valuable to approach problems from different perspectives. It gives you a better outcome when you're doing analysis. So, know what you like, but then challenge yourself. Maybe get outside your comfort zone to try a different type of analysis. When we're doing CTI analysis, what is it we're trying to do? Oftentimes, one thing analysts try to do is start to cluster together activity across different intrusions, whether if you're a vendor from different customers, whether it's things you found on VirusTotal or your own intrusions, trying to form those patterns so we can start to see what have adversaries done in the past, trying to create those threat models. So as people cluster activity, there are a lot of different terms for this. Threat actors or threat groups, activity groups, campaigns, intrusion sets, just different ways to describe clusters of activity. And it's important to note that there are a lot of different ways to do this as well. Terms that are more nebulous, maybe like threat actor, campaign, intrusion set, they don't have a set definition. There are some definitions out there, but they tend to be a little broad in describing some kind of cluster of malicious activity. And so analysts might do that in different ways, looking at overlap in command and control infrastructure, maybe victim overlap. And then we get to activity groups, which is a very specific way to cluster data that we'll talk about. This concept was introduced by Sergio, Andy, and Chris in the Diamond Model paper, which I highly recommend. There are a lot of foundational CTI concepts in there. Take some time, it's a meaty paper, so maybe break it up across a few different days, but take a look at that Diamond Model paper, and it introduces this concept of activity groups, which are just clusters of intrusions using some kind of mathematical weight or scoring. And this is one interesting thing about the Diamond Model paper is that, you look at the Diamond Model and you're like, yeah, it's really simple. It's just these 4 points. Well, if you dive into that paper, the methodology they describe, there's actually some equations in there, some math. I know it's kind of scary, but there's a mathematical process you can go through to try to weight what you care about based on your requirements. Do I care about capability or infrastructure, adversary or victim more? And then start to cluster together those different intrusions. So the process that they recommend in that paper, that's kind of a lot of work. Maybe you're not an equation person, I'm really not. So luckily there's a shortcut you can use called the rule of 2. to use the diamond model to create these different activity groups. The idea here is, remember back in that processing and exploitation phase, we kind of broke down the information and data we had. Maybe you use a diamond model and you say, okay, every intrusion we have, we're going to break it out into those 4 vertices and list what we know for infrastructure, for victim, for adversary, for capability. What you can do here with something like the rule of 2 is then use that bucketed data, start to bring it together, start to look for overlaps between those different vertices of the diamond model. So how might that look? Here's an example. So let's say we have an activity group that we're starting to create called Fuzzy Squirrel. So we've looked across a bunch of different intrusions and we've said, well, we've seen a few different intrusions that have used a specific range of Chinese university IPs. That's under that infrastructure vertex. And those same intrusions, we also found that they were using poison ivy with a specific mutex, that little marker in memory that says the malware is running already. So we've said, okay, there are 2 different vertices of the diamond model. And in each of these intrusions, we've seen these commonalities. So let's cluster them together. And let's say, well, anytime we see these specific university IPs and we see the specific poison ivy mutex, let's call that fuzzy squirrel. It's our first activity group. Similarly, we've looked through, we found, okay, well, there are intrusions that target Chinese dissidents as a group and then also use Google Docs for infrastructure. That's Angry Hippo. Others, Zesty Unicorn, Citrus Fiesta, whatever fun names or naming conventions, whether it's My Little Pony or Elements, whatever your team uses, you can start to cluster together these different intrusions using the activity group rule of thumb, this rule of 2 that we use, if you don't want to use the whole scientific methodology that's outlined in the paper, which you can also do. So again, common analysis method here, the analyst will often have to cluster activity, and there are many ways to do that. The rule of 2 using a diamond model is one great way because it's defensible. You can say, here's kind of what I've done and show your work a little bit. I'm seeing overlap in 2 vertices, so I'm going to cluster that into an activity group. So that's our analysis. As we do analysis, we have to make sure that we're being aware of those cognitive biases, using structured analytic techniques, taking that information that maybe we've bucketed using those different frameworks and models, and we've done analysis, often trying to create these clusters using the rule of 2 or some other methodology. And again, we're always thinking about those requirements that we started with back in that planning and direction phase. So we've done some analysis. We have some information, intel we want to get out. Well, we have to disseminate it. Goes back to what I said at the beginning. CTI is not this self-licking ice cream cone. We do CTI for someone else, so we have to get that out. And the key as we try to disseminate threat intel is knowing your audience. If you have the best threat intel ever, but you send it to the wrong person or it's not in a language they understand, they're not going to find it very useful. So think about who your audience is and what their needs are. Start to think through what are their problems, what language they use even. Maybe you don't want to use overly technical language if you're talking to an executive. And regardless of what you disseminate, please do not use pew pew maps. Pew pew maps are terrible. There's an example there on the slide. Just don't do it. Never disseminate pew pew maps. We think about audience. I mentioned this strategic, operational, and tactical earlier when we were talking about requirements. And these 3 levels are sometimes misunderstood. This is all about the audience for your intel, for what you're disseminating. Again, a strategic level might be those executives, those high-level decision maker. Operational level is often, CTI analysts themselves or maybe SOC analysts. Tactical level might be the people with, eyes on the ground doing that day-to-day analysis and defense of your networks. So keep in mind who the audience is. Do they maybe need Yara signatures? Do they need indicators or TTPs they can sweep across a network? Or do they need to know, should we, acquire this company at a strategic level? Again, think about your audience and their requirements as you're trying to disseminate your intel. Many times dissemination, the analysis into the dissemination part of the process is where we write reports. Something we all have to do. I always say it does not hurt to have a good tech writer or someone with maybe a liberal arts background like I have on your team to help you write reports that people can actually understand. Some tips on as you write reports, tell a story, tell an honest story as well. Our communication folks at MITRE always encourage us to do this because if you tell a story, people are more likely to understand what you're saying. So take your reader through, what happened first, what happened next, why do they care? Have that bottom line up front, that bluff at the beginning of your report. Don't make someone read through 15 pages to, find out that, oh, you think that it was the Iranian government behind an intrusion. Put that up front. What do they need to know in the beginning of the report? If you have some kind of action, maybe for an executive, maybe you need more resources to get malware collection, request that up front in that bluff. Again, don't make them read through your huge report just to find out you need something. If you include metrics, include ones that matter. Metrics are a tough thing. There's a great presentation from my friends Tony and Marika from last year's CTI Summit where they talk about useful metrics. Try to focus on metrics that are meaningful, not just maybe counts of IPs or scans, things like that. Bring your report to life. If you have graphics people, that's awesome. Good graphics can make a report really effective. Or you can do a lot just in Microsoft Office. Microsoft Paint is great for making graphics as well. Give credit to others. As CTI analysts, you'll be using a lot of different collection sources. We talked about that internal incident data. Maybe you'll use that. You'll use that intrusion analysis. Well, if you're working with incident responders and they gave you data, give them credit, especially if your executives are reading that report. Really important because you want them to be sharing information next time you need it. So give them credit, especially to the people that matter. And one piece of advice you'll often see in different blog posts and threat intel reports, a technical appendix, which is great because maybe you have a list of indicators or TTPs or some other technical information that won't change your overall assessment or the crux of the report. So if you put that in an appendix, then you can change that later, update that as you need to, but then the rest of the report stands. And it's kind of nice if you have this technical appendices and you have indicator or TTP lists, highly recommend to put those in structured formats. I've seen a few kind of lists of IPs and hashes in PDF format, which may not be the most useful. So if you have the power to do that, please help be that change. In analysis and production, and as we go into that dissemination, you'll often be asked to give an assessment. Now, CTI is a human discipline. If something were a fact, you wouldn't need an analyst to make an assessment about it. Now, remember that there's always going to be some uncertainty. So I love this equation that as you're talking about an assessment that you have of certain information that you've collected, bring together your confidence level, what your analysis is, the evidence you have, and the sources of it. So maybe, I assess with high confidence that this webinar will end at 4:30 p.m. Eastern because the SANS website told me so, and it's reported reliably in the past. So this confidence idea is really, really important because, again, we as analysts are never going to have all the information we want. We're greedy. We want to know everything, but it's tough because you're always going to want more collection. You're always going to say, hey, if only I had this other malware collection source or this other resource external data. You're always going to want more data. But part of our job is to make assessments based off of limited information with what we have in the time that we have. And so there's always going to be a confidence level. High, moderate, and low are common ones that folks will use. High confidence should be pretty rare. This is another thing that's often misunderstood in Intel overall is thinking that only high confidence assessments matter. That's not at all true. Any assessment, even if it's low confidence, that's more information than you had before. So it's using the assessment you had to provide to whatever decision maker. They didn't have that information or that assessment before. They didn't have that intel before. They had no data or information. Now they have an assessment. If it's low confidence, maybe that means, well, there are other hypotheses that exist. Maybe we don't have a ton of evidence, but there's still evidence to support that assessment. That's low confidence. Moderate, well, maybe you have some evidence missing, or there's something new that might invalidate that. So moderate. High confidence should be pretty rare that you have that. Again, because you have no evidence against something. You'd need to hit that level to have this high confidence threshold as you would choose to define it. So these are kind of some benchmark guidelines for how you might define each of these. Definitely recommend on your team decide what you think a high confidence assessment is. This could be a starting place. There's also CIA has a lot of great resources on their website about words of probability, words of uncertainty. And as analysts, though, it's our challenge to really take this information we have, make an assessment, and make sure we couch what our confidence level is. Do we think it's likely to change in the future? What information do we have that supports our assessment? which is really the job of the CTI analyst, is to make an assessment, do analysis that's responsive to some requirement. So as we start to wrap up here, again, what we've talked about today is how cyber threat intel is a process. It's not just a finished product. As you plan out your team, you got to set up your team. You got to come up with those requirements, a threat model, a collection management framework. You have to collect information and data from different places, malware, your own intrusions, different domain sources, TLS certs. Once you have that collected information, you have to process it somehow. Maybe you bucket it using different frameworks, exploit it, maybe you store it in a tip. Then you have to do analysis. As you do analysis, remembering those biases, those cognitive biases that might lead you to making poorer assessments than you would otherwise. Trying to cluster together different activity, whether it's using activity groups, the rule of two, or another method. Lastly, you have to disseminate that intel. Someone gave you a requirement during that planning and direction phase. Got to disseminate the intel that you've produced back to them, whether it's in a report. And if you make that assessment, make sure you include the confidence level so your consumer understands what you're trying to convey to them and the certainty that you have. And then, of course, this is a whole process. Maybe you disseminate that report and your executive says, well, that's great and all, but what I really care about is this. Great, that's a new requirement for you to start this whole process again. The point here is really just that CTI is both a product and a process. It's a human process where you have to go through and think about all these different things. So hopefully today I've given you a couple things to think about in each of these phases. If you're trying to set up a CTI team or you already have one that you're working through. So I've spent the last couple minutes talking to you about what I think about CTI. We have a great event called the SANS Cyber Threat Intel Summit every year. The call for presentations is currently open, scheduled to close, I believe, next week. So, one thing I love about CTI is, great, I've given you my perspective on it. There are so many different perspectives on CTI. And so we'd love to hear yours. Please go to the SANS.org/CTI Summit, submit a proposal. I'm also happy, reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Hey, do you think this is a good idea? I'm not really sure if I should submit. Yes, you should submit. Presenting is a great way to share back with the community, get a name for yourself, and meet some awesome people. So I wanted to mention that. If you've enjoyed this webinar, all this content was taken directly from the Forensics 578 class with credit to Robert M. Lee, who's the author behind that class. So I'm teaching in September in Dallas and December in San Francisco. Lots of other offerings from Rob, from Peter, from Jake, other great instructors, but it's a 5-day class. We roughly cover a lot of the topics I talked about today, just in much more depth. I just scratched the surface of everything there is to talk about. I have a lot of fun exercises and labs. It's a pretty fun class. So if you enjoyed today, please consider whether you'd like to come to Forensics 578. I hope to see you in a future class. And with that, we have a couple minutes. I'll turn it back over to Carol for any questions.
All right, thanks, Katie, for that great presentation. We do have some questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for Katie, please enter it into the questions window now. So someone asks, is this book a good source to make your threat model and derive the intelligence requirements from them? It looks like the book is called Threat Modeling, Designing for Security.
I'm actually not familiar with that book, so I'm going to take a note to check that out. I think that, there are a lot of different approaches to threat modeling in general, and I would just encourage you to kind of take a look at what the book recommends. You can start really high level, but as long as it, gives you a way to kind of break down what you know about your organization and what you know about adversaries could be useful, but not familiar with that one myself. So thanks for the recommendation.
All right, thanks. This next one is just it sounds like someone found a typo, which I can also adjust in the slide deck. They said, in your chart, FQDN is transposed a letter to read FQND.
Oh, so it is. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. We'll get that taken care of. Maybe it's a different FD. No, that's totally a typo. Thank you.
I only say that in case you were planning on reusing this slide deck, because I can change it for the one that's going to be loaded. All right, for the SOC team, do you suggest any open intelligence resources that really help us?
So again, it kind of depends what you're looking for. There's a great GitHub site called Awesome Threat Intelligence that brings together a ton of different resources. I think open source data feeds we talked about, they can be really useful. Things like all kinds of, Robtex is one open source who is, malware domain list, lots of different sources. I think those can be really useful. I would just caution that if you're looking at data feeds in particular, a lot of the open source ones, I mean, they're free, so they may be less vetted. Another great one to look at is a SANS Internet Storm Center. That's a pretty carefully vetted one. So yeah, I think open source data feeds and other sources can be really useful for SOCs. Just use with caution. Remember, look at who the source is. Is it someone you trust? How much have they vetted it? Kind of ask questions, and remember that anything open source is kind of buyer beware.
All right, thanks. Let's see here. Is there some kind of basic questionnaire available that you could use as a basis to give to your company or client and get a good start during your intelligence requirements meeting? They say this way they could first think about these questions before you come together so they can collect all the business info and other info.
That's a great idea. I don't think I've seen one, but I think you have that idea, so you should create one yourself. I think that's a great idea that, I'd recommend as you start out as a CTI team, get to know your organization. So maybe if you having a meeting a week before that meeting, set up a list of maybe it's questions like, what keeps you busy during the day? Or, what are the challenges you have currently? What are some of your resource constraints? Things like that. I think that'd be a great thing to do. So good suggestion. I don't think I've seen anything like that, but maybe someone as a result of this call will create one.
All right, thanks. How can CTI be mapped efficiently to risk assessment methodologies?
Yeah, so this is one challenge I see with a lot of risk assessment methodologies is that they don't take threats into consideration. It's sort of in a vacuum. So we've seen this a lot on the attack side, actually, and we're starting to look at, on the attack side, how do we map different attack techniques to security controls to help kind of marry up those things. So at a high level, I would just say that, CTI teams should be talking to risk folks very carefully. And if you can start to provide the information on what adversaries are doing as a way to prioritize, hey, okay, you have your risk, frameworks, and you should, those have a lot of value, but if you can inject into that process and say, well, here's why these risk frameworks exist, because a lot of them are based in real threats. If you can start to inject into that and start to, map whether it's different TTPs maybe you've seen adversaries do. Attack could be one way to do that. Start to map those to, well, why are we following this control or taking this response in response to a risk management framework? I think threat intel has a lot to say there, and those two teams don't always talk as much as they should.
All right, thanks. A couple of bits of feedback. Someone says, awesome slide deck and narration. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Someone else says, fantastic prezzo, Katie. And they follow up with a question. Where would you recommend folks new to InfoSec? Where would you recommend folks new to InfoSec and more specifically CTI start?
Great question. You kind of set me up for self-promotion there. I have a personal blog on Medium that you can, if you follow me on Twitter, the link's there. I gave the top 10 list for different things to start reading. So I've mentioned a few of them today. The Kill Chain paper by Lockheed Martin is one. The Diamond Model paper is another foundational one. Taking a look at MITRE ATT&CK is one. A Psychology of Intelligence Analysis is one, that book by Richard Hoyer. So there are a lot of free and open sources. So if you check out my blog posts, I've brought together all those things that I've just mentioned and a few others. We also mentioned the SANS CTI Summit. That's an annual event. There are lots of videos and slide decks from previous years. It's a wealth of information in all of those resources. So if you are dedicated, you can learn quite a bit about CTI on your own.
All right, I know you can't see the questions, but I believe you answered this one just now. Are there people we should follow on Twitter that will be great sources? Anything more to add?
Yeah, there's so many, and I'm going to forget someone. Obviously, I'm at like the coins. I mentioned Sergio, he's at CNO Analysis. All of, the Kill Chain Diamond Model attack folks are great follows. Folks at Dragos, Joe Slowick is awesome. Drunk Binary, despite his name, he's awesome. Yeah, lots of folks, if you look at, I'd say the SANS CTI Summit list is a great place to start. My friend Sarah Jones spoke last year. She's awesome. There are just so many people I'm forgetting. But yeah, if you follow me and look at who I follow, that's a good place to start as well. Twitter is a great place for CTI analysts to have spirited conversations about things like threat actor names.
All right, so Katie, we are at the end of our time. However, I can hang on for a couple more minutes if you have a few more minutes for questions, or we can simply refer people to submit them to q@sans.org or reach out to you directly. What are your thoughts? We have about 5 more questions.
I think let's email them because I want to be respectful of folks' time. I like to be on time kind of person. So if you want to follow up via email, we can do that.
All right, great. Okay, so, well, thank you so much for this great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.